the point of the parable is it's a present and future piece. There's a tension, present and future. The kingdom is essentially something that is of the future, not something that can be fully possessed right now. But people who have really caught a glimpse of it from the teaching of Jesus know the treasure upon which they have lighted. At present, he cannot deliver to them or place them fully within it. That happens with the death and resurrection of Jesus. The flowering of the kingdom occurs with the coming of the Spirit in Pentecost. But the glimpse they have already gives them the freedom to sell all they have so that in one day coming they may possess it. So it's a present and future image that Jesus is portraying. It's not all something that happens within a week's time. You see it, you get a glimpse of it, you know you want it, you don't have it, you wrestle with how much you do want it, you agree that you want it as much as anything in life, then you make room for it, and ultimately you possess it. Now we have the parable of the dragnet. In addition to the truths revealed in the first two parables, that is the parable of the pearl and the treasure, in addition to the truths of those two parables, this parable contains two further truths about the kingdom of God. Now let's read the parable. Verse 47 to 50. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a dragnet, a fishing net, cast into the sea that brings in a haul of all kinds of fish. And when it is full, the fishermen haul it ashore, and then sitting down, they collect the good ones in a basket and throw away those that are no use. This is how it will be at the end of time. The angels will appear and separate the wicked from the just to throw them into the blazing furnace, where there will be weeping and grinding of teeth. Okay. Number one, God's grace is a great net, is the dragnet. That's the seed God is sowing. The image now is it's a dragnet that it is thrown over all that is, both good and bad. It's indiscriminate. So just as the scattering of the seed was indiscriminate, so the throwing out of the dragnet, the fishing is indiscriminate. It brings everything in. Good fish, bad fish, and old tires. It moves everything in. You don't have to be good to be grasped by the kingdom. That the kingdom can be preached to a sinner. The kingdom can be preached to a tax collector. The kingdom can be preached to an outsider. And that person can come within the scope of the kingdom. And there are examples of that in the scriptures. So the grace of God covers it all. Once one is within the kingdom, once one has accepted the word, then conversion is required. That's the go and sell thing. Those who do not over time respond positively to God's generosity will find themselves cast out as a fisherman throws away bad fish. So, the dragnet goes out. The dragnet is God's grace. Everything is pulled in. The grace of God is equally bestowed upon all, good and bad. Then there's a period of time in which a person is able to, in accepting it, to undergo conversion, to change his or her life. And it's over a period of time. It's not instantaneous. And so if they do not ultimately respond positively to God's generosity, then they are like the fish that are thrown out. This parable explains the presence of both good and bad in the kingdom, but goes on to assert that the situation will not stand forever. There are many parables that talk about that. The man who sowed wheat in his field, and then his workers come to him and say, didn't you sow good seed? I mean, you've got weeds growing all over the place. And the man says, well, it must have been an enemy of mine who did that, who sowed those weeds. And the servants say, well, let's go out and weed those fields, pull those weeds out. And the man says, no, don't do that. Don't do that. Just let them grow. Let them grow side by side. And at the harvest, at the end, then we'll bundle up the weeds and we'll throw them in the fire. And we'll take the wheat and put it in my barn. It's the same story, if you will, as the story of the dragnet. Good and evil people all are part of God's gracious desire to share the kingdom, to call them into the kingdom. In the end, that's really in Matthew what the final day is. That's what the final judgment in chapter 25 is about. He doesn't talk about good and bad, he talks about sheep and goats. And so these people have been given all this time, the grace of God has been there, and then Jesus says, at the end of time, the Son of Man will come seated on the cloud with his angels around him, and he will call all the nations to him and divide them as a shepherd divides sheep and goats. The sheep on one side, the goats on the other. And then he will say to the sheep, come, enter the kingdom that has been prepared for you from the foundation of the world. The kingdom that Jesus preached is now theirs. Come into that kingdom. For I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty and you gave me to drink. I was naked and you clothed me. I was a visitor and you took care of me. I was in prison and you stood by me. I was a sick person and you attended to me. And then they'll say, why? How did we do that? And he'll reveal to them that when you did that to the least, that's when you did it to me. So that's the end of the story that Matthew is telling. And that accepting the grace of the kingdom and acting out on it has to do with the way I treat my neighbor. It's not a question of head. It's a question of heart, where where my heart goes out. Jesus will say in another place, where a person's heart is, that's where their treasure really is. That's what they treasure. So the stories of the kingdom come to fulfillment at the end, the 25th chapter. Now, what we're going to do is, what we're going to do is go to the multiplication of loaves and fishes. The story of feeding the 5,000 is found in all four of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And in Matthew and Mark, there's a second story of the feeding of the 4,000. So it clearly is an incident that had a profound power on the early church. That it would be recorded everywhere, and even that there would be, in the handing on of the story, there would be doublets that took place. So it wasn't 5,000, 4,000, it's a big crowd. It looks back to a biblical tradition about the miraculous offering of manna, which Israel was fed with in the wilderness, and the prophet Elisha's feeding of 100. There was a man who came bringing first fruits to the man of God, 20 loaves of barley and fresh ears of grain in his sack. Elisha said, "Give it to the people and let them eat." But the servant said, "How can I set this before 100 people?" So Elisha repeated, "Give it to the people and let them eat, for thus says the Lord, they shall eat and have some left over." He sets before them the bread, they eat and have some left according to the word of God. So Jesus' contemporaries, as he's preaching and as this is happening, they know the story of Elisha. And they know the story of manna in the desert. It's part of their very makeup as Jews. And so Jesus does the same thing. And what he's saying is that it's a way of, if you will, announcing his divinity. Now, everyone will agree that it is God who gave manna in the desert, and in the chapter in 2 Kings, the prophet says that it is the Lord who tells you to do this. It is God who tells you to do this. And so Jesus does it, and he does it in a way that the onlooker can see that he's claiming to be doing the same thing as Elijah did. He is a visible presence of God, of the action of God. Now, from the early church time, this multiplication was seen as a foreshadowing of the Eucharist. You see, in St. John's Gospel, at the Last Supper, there is no Eucharist. There is no bread and wine and do this in memory of me. There's none of that. In St. John's Gospel, if you will, the Eucharist is found in the 6th chapter, the story of the multiplication, and then that long teaching of "I am the bread of life" that takes place. But at the Last Supper, the result of the Eucharist is demonstrated in that Jesus goes around and washes the feet of his disciples, that he does a servant thing, that he acts as servant to them. And it's reminiscent of what he says, the Son of Man has come not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So that's what he's, if you will, acting out. The other 3 Gospels, of course, have Jesus at the table and Jesus taking the bread and saying, "This is my body," and taking the cup and saying, "This is my blood, and do this in memory of me." Now, the church obviously took the pattern from the first 3 evangelists, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It did not take the pattern from John. I mean, if the pattern for John were taken, we would all come to church on a Sunday morning, and the job of the priest would be to get on his hands and knees and drag a bucket throughout the whole church and wash people's feet, and say, "This is the presence of God's grace. This is the transformative power in this washing." Because Peter says, "You can't wash my feet," and Jesus said, "If I don't wash your feet, you cannot have life in me." This is sacramental. This is effective. Now, in the first 3, Jesus, in a sense, gives the direction of the Eucharist. He anticipates the Eucharistic gestures. He takes the loaves, he blesses them, he breaks them, and he gives them. And that's what happens in the Eucharist. The bread is taken, received. The bread is blessed. The Eucharistic prayer is prayed over the bread. The bread is broken, and the bread is then given. So if you will, the gestures or the rubrics of the Eucharist are the gestures and the rubrics that are present in this story of the multiplication of loaves and fishes. Now, there's a little known, I shouldn't say little known, there's an activity that took place in the early church that doesn't take place anymore. And it has to do with this parable. And it has to do with the fish. see, in all of these stories, it's not bread and wine. It's bread and fish. Many pious Jews on the Sabbath, they have their Sabbath meal, and many of them, more often than not, will serve fish. Because the abundance of fish is the sign of the Messiah. The prophets say that when the Messiah comes, the streams will be filled with fish, and the trees will be laden with fruit, and all of these wonderful, glorious things will take place. But there will be an abundance of fish in the sea. And so the Sabbath, the Shabbat meal, is really a looking to the Messiah, a looking to the promise. And so sometimes among people the fish is used, again, in a religious context, in a way of, another way of expressing what the Sabbath meal is about. All right. There are places, obviously, in the early church where the Eucharist was celebrated with bread and fish. And the reason we know that is we've got artwork that displays it. We've got artwork of people standing and there being loaves of bread and there being a basket of fish. And that clearly this is a Eucharistic gathering. Remember, the Eucharist took place at the homes of people initially. That, for the first 3 centuries, there was persecution. And so people would gather in homes and they would celebrate the Eucharist around the dining room table. They would read from the Word and they would pray and they would have discussion and reflection and then there would be the Eucharistic meal. And some authors say that sometimes that Eucharist took place within the context of a larger meal. That maybe there was other things on the table and that at one point the person who is leading the Eucharist takes the bread and breaks it and says the prayer and hands it around to people and then hands around pieces of the fish, dried fish. This is not wet, slimy fish that's taken out of the lake. This is dried fish that people would carry on a picnic. And so breaks the fish and hands that around. Now, obviously that didn't survive. Obviously that practice was a very limited practice and quickly passed out of use. The church, the larger church community, chose to follow the model that is present in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Okay, there is I've got the walking on water, but we don't have a lot of time. So we're going to move to chapter 16, the confession of St. Peter. Jesus and the disciples come into the region of Caesarea Philippi, and Jesus says to them, "Now who do they say that the Son of Man is?" And they tell him that the people talk about him, and they talk about him as a prophet. Some say you're Jeremiah, some say you're John the Baptist come back from the dead, some say you're Isaiah, some say you're one of the other prophets. And Jesus says to them, "But you, who do you say that I am?" Now this is the first time in the story that there is a confession of faith. Peter speaks up for them and says, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." That's, you are the son of David, the Son of God. The Messiah is to come out of the line of David. You are the Son of David, you are the Son of God. You are the Messiah, you are the Son of God. And Jesus says, "Blessed are you, Simon. Human reason hasn't disclosed this to you, but my Father in heaven." And then he says, "I'm putting you in charge. I will give you the keys." Now, The keys. Everyone would know what they symbolize because of the story in Isaiah the prophet. We're told that on a certain day, the king will come and call his servant Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, and will clothe him with your robe, the robe of Shebna, the one who's being kicked out. Clothe him with your robe, bind your sash around him. I will commit your authority to his hand. He shall be father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and to the house of Judah. I will place on his shoulder the key of the house of David. He shall open and no one shall shut. He shall shut and no one shall open. They would not miss that, and that clearly is, if you will, the Old Testament background to what Jesus is doing with Peter. I will give to you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and what you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and what you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. This is not a teaching about the infallibility of the Pope. This is a teaching about leadership. And that they are not, as Jesus said any number of places, you're not to lord your power over others. That's what the Gentiles do. So the job of the leader is to be wise and to be able to assess a situation and to bind and loose. That is to say, to permit or not to permit. Now, every parent knows how that works. In raising children, you've got to make decisions as to when is the time for them to do this and when isn't it? When is it appropriate? And so the binding and loosing is to be a judgment made by the church, because later on it's not just Peter in the 18th chapter, it's the whole community is making this judgment. It's a judgment to be made by the church about the appropriateness of an action. Now, the rule of thumb has always been that if you bind too tightly, if you restrict too much, you create rebellion. And if you bind too loosely, if you have, in a sense, no boundaries, then you create chaos. So there must be a binding and a loosing that favors the growth and the strength of the community. Before Cardinal Ratzinger became Pope Benedict, he said in one place, talking on this text, he said, the Episcopalians have really learned the art of loosing. And the Roman Catholics have really learned the art of binding. And that was not a compliment to either one. That there needs to be a quality. The function of authority is to serve the community. I come not to be served, but to serve.